I am Francis O'Brien. I am a native of Portland, Maine, and I've just passed my 85th birthday. And although I have no great amount of wisdom to offer you, I would be glad to go over my life in some respects, and would be glad to answer almost any question you want to ask, even personal ones. But I was born in Portland. I came from a family of, I suppose you'd call them Irish Americans. They'd been here for 2 or 3 generations the time I arrived, and were fairly well settled in. They weren't terribly well off in most ways, although I did have a grandfather who came here in 1840 who had become quite prosperous. And when he died, he managed to leave a good bit of money to the church. He was a very religious Catholic. And the rest of the money that was left over was enough to keep my family going for 2 generations. And I often think that they weren't bright enough to invest the money so it lasted in the family. They just spent it until it ran out. But when it came to my grandfather was started out as an apprentice in a wholesale shoe business, and eventually ended up owning his own shoe shop on Congress Street near Washington Avenue, which was then about the center of most of the Irish settlement in Portland, right at the foot of Munjoy Hill. And my grandfather had a fairly prosperous business, and all his sons, including my father, were brought up in the business. But by the time they got to in their 20s, they decided they didn't care for it, and they all became government employees. They all went into the civil service in one way or another. My father joined the railway mail service when he was, just before he got married, 1907, and spent the rest of his life in it, 40-odd years. So that the very early years of my life were spent on Munjoy Hill, where there was some family property, and we lived a sort of very ordinary, sort of middle-class life, lower middle class, or whatever you want to call it. In the beginning, I think the first schools that I went to were Catholic schools. We were Roman Catholic at that time. And I remember going to a sort of kindergarten run by some nuns, at a place where I was very happy at the age of 4 or 5, whatever it was. And subsequently, I think we lived in Portland for about the first 4 years of my life. And then my mother and father decided to move out to the suburbs, so we moved out to what was known as East Darien, about 1.5 miles from the center of Portland. And this was not a single house. We lived in a large flat house with 6 flats in it, and it was still country to some extent, although the area had been settled with old houses probably for 100, 150 years. But my father had not gone to school very long. I think he graduated in the 8th grade at the old North School in Portland. But he was working for his father from that time on, so he never went to high school. But my mother had come from a family that was much more interested in education, and she was sent to a convent school here in Portland, known as the St. Elizabeth's Academy, which was about where the city center is now on Free Street. And she graduated from the academy, and had always had a taste for books and music and things like that. And as a matter of fact, was quite a nice piano player. And always had some books. She always had a bookcase of books of her own. And they were mostly the standard classics, like Longfellow's poems and that sort of thing. Probably with a few novels that I'm sure were more or less standard things that nothing that could do her any harm. And but I don't remember my father ever sitting down and reading a book until he was a very, very old man. And that happened long after I had gone into the book business. And he began to really, at maybe 75 or 80, had begun to sort of take care of my bookshop when I wasn't there, and really had developed a taste for not only books, but a lot of other cultural things. Rather remarkable for a man that had been very active in his own business for years, but had never had much to do with books. But I think with my mother's books, I sort of got a funny feeling for libraries. When I first began to go to libraries, I was fascinated by the idea of great quantities of books. And in fact, I played at being a librarian at home. I used to take my mother's books and make little cards for them and stamp them, and she never objected to it. And so that I would sometimes give out books to my friends and try to get them interested in books. I give these books out to my friends and always making sure they would bring them back. I would make up library cards for them. And soon after that, I began to go to a school in East Darien called the Cummings School. And I suppose by this time I was 6 or 7 years old. And we found that there was an old discontinued library room there that had been there for many, many years and had been closed up. And another boy and I, this boy, by the way, was a paraplegic. His name was Hassel, Leslie Hassel, Hassell. And Leslie lived near me and was one of a fairly large family, but was on crutches, and in fact was on crutches the rest of his life, and ended up having a rather remarkable life because as an older man, or middle-aged man, he became a sort of a genius at clockmaking and clock repairing and that sort of thing. And he was so good that in World War II, the Navy appointed him a commander in the Navy in charge of some very important clock work in Washington. But anyway, at this period, when Leslie and I were probably 6 or 7 years old, we went to the principal of the school, a woman we call Mom Elwell, and a formidable little lady who was really an object of fear to most of the kids in the school, but underneath it all was a very fine, very cheerful and good person. And we asked her about this library and why it was closed up and so forth. And she said, well, they closed it up years ago before I even came here. And so we more or less begged her to let us open this room and clean the books and run a regular library there, which she let us do. And so for the next 2 or 3 years, we were the librarians in the school. And some of the books had gone back in the 1860s or 70s, around the time the school was open. And so that gave us a great taste for handling books and that sort of thing. And Leslie could not operate very well in crutches, so I did most of the physical work. But we made quite a production out of it, and the kids sort of followed us, and we, I think, talked a lot of them into using books, who otherwise would probably not have done so. So anyway, we stayed there for until I graduated, but in the meantime, I graduated at the age of 12, and in fact, I was the class prophet. In those days, even in high school, or even in grammar school, we've had very formal graduations, and I can remember now, I don't have a copy of the prophecy that I wrote, but I can remember now making up some very odd prophecies for the other people in the class, and got a good laugh at the time of graduation. But in the meantime, when I was about 9 years old, my mother, by that time, by the way, there were 5 children in the family, and my mother took quite ill in the winter of 1918. It was the time of this terrible flu epidemic that went all over the country, and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were lost as a result. And so my mother ended up in the hospital, and incidentally she was pregnant with another child and lost that child. That was the only one in my family that was lost at that time. But so we had a very good network of relatives. I had my mother's people who were always very kindly and very caring for us children. And my father's family, somewhat less so. We were never as close to my father's family as we were to my mother's. And they had an old house that had been in the family since about 1830, well, 1840, I guess it was. And my grandfather, his name was Massey, Godfrey Massey, had come over from Ireland sometime about 1840 and married my grandmother, whose name was Susan Parker. And she came from Halifax, from St. John, New Brunswick. And when they married, they came to Portland, and they bought an old house on what is virtually the Eastern Promenade, on what is now known as North Street. And they had that house moved down on the side of the hill because my grandfather, my great-grandfather, was very fond of grapes. In fact, made his own wine, and had found a wonderful sunny location on the side of the hill. Land was very cheap in those days, and I presume he did pay an awful lot for his house. It was an old frame house. But it wasn't any more difficult to move houses in those days than it is now, except, of course, it was done with oxen or horses, or very many horses. And so that house was brought down over the side of the hill, set up there. And it really became the center of our family life. And it was a family of, well, there were 3 girls and 4 boys. And one of the girls was my grandmother, who married a man named Peter Crosby, who died very young. And together they had 2 children. They had my mother and my brother. And so my mother was brought up in that house. And it was a fairly spacious house. It was well furnished because people were very fussy about their furniture and about other things. They had lots of books. And it was a house where I suppose I spent more happy days in my childhood than any other place that I ever stayed in. And I used to go there almost every weekend. I'd go there on a Friday night and stay probably over through Sunday, and then go back home. But at any rate, at this period that I'm speaking about, my mother was in the Maine Medical Center, what is now the Maine Medical Center, then known as the Maine General Hospital. And she was there for about 9 or 10 months, and had a very severe sickness, but finally recovered from it, and in fact lived a long time afterwards. She lived till she was she was over 75 years old. She died. So that the idea was to organize the children and put them around with various relatives. Well, now my grandmother Crosby and her sisters, the Massey girls, that is Mary and Julia, took my father and the rest of the family, my 3 sisters and my brother, and an aunt who lived on State Street in a rather grand house, took me. And I really enjoyed a wonderful year with her. They lived in a house which now is owned by the Maine General, by the Mercy Hospital. It was a big brick double house right next to the building where the Red Cross was for many years. And State Street in those days was probably the grandest street in town. That had wonderful elm trees. In fact, the elm trees just arched over the street. It was like going through a boa if you're going up or down State Street. Of course, at the end of State Street, where it met Congress Street, it was the Longfellow Monument. which had been there since around 1900, 1899, 1900. And that, of course, that section is now known as Longfellow Square. And the children of the country had really raised the money through their pennies and nickels and dimes to build that monument. I think it was 1898, if I'm not mistaken. And they very successfully raised this money, which didn't amount to more than $10,000 for that magnificent statue. But at any rate, this gave me an altogether new concept for the city of Portland, because where I was brought up in the East End and in Deering, I didn't know very much about the West End of Portland, the peninsula. And the one thing we have to remember about Portland is that Portland is really built like a saddle. And on the one end, you've got this magnificent view of Casco Bay and the islands. And on the other promontory is the Western Promenade with its view of the White Mountains on a good day. And at that time was full of rather large estates that later on were torn down. And what we know today as the West End was basically, not as far as the promenade is concerned, was made up of streets that were named after the children of the man who was then the richest man in Maine, probably, John Bundy Brown. And Bundy Brown in the 1870s had built this magnificent estate, which is known as Bramhall. And it was like an English manor house. And he had lived there only a short time when he died, and eventually the family more or less abandoned the house, had it torn down. But all the streets in that area, like Bowden Street, Carroll Street, Pine Street, and the others were all built on this, bisecting this great estate of that period. And so that, so far as my actions are concerned, I began to do an awful lot of walking in the west end of the city, all the way out to Libbytown, which is out where I'm going. Mm-hmm. Well, during this period, of course, I had to abandon the public school that I'd gone to. So my aunt sent me to what was then known as the Catholic Grammar School on Free Street, just about in the same location that the city center is in now, when they have the games and things. And so I was then 9 years old. I think I became 10 years old on December 8th of 1918. And of course the war had been going on for some time. And I think, like most boys of that period, we really had no great understanding of what was involved in the World War, except that we all became very patriotic, and of course they took every pains to see that we did become patriotic and back to war. Among other things, they encouraged us to spend what little money we had or made for war savings stamps. And I can remember how fanatical I was about going out and shoveling snow and doing all kinds of errands to get 25 cents together to go and buy a war savings stamp. And I found that being in town and having a rather, I suppose in a way, a kind of ambitious attitude about things, that I went looking for all kinds of jobs. Well, now, I didn't really need a job because my aunt, who was quite well off, took good care of me and saw that I had plenty of spending money. But I was always looking for jobs and would get one job after another. And I was also, I used to pester neighbors in the neighborhood there to buy things that one of the grocery stores would have boys go out and solicit. Grand Union Tea Company, I think it was called, or something like that. And they'd give us a small percentage of what we sold. And these were mostly spices and salad oils and, all sorts of things that people might be out of it from time to time. But the thing you have to remember about Portland in those days, that there were over 100 grocery stores in Portland. I think almost every corner had a grocery store. And very often, a lot of corners would have drugstores where they probably were selling hot booze under the counter to sell liquor.
During Prohibition.
And during Prohibition, yeah. And so that very often, I would say probably, there were probably at least a quarter, or a fourth as many drugstores in Portland as there were grocery stores. And of course, in those days, the little grocery stores all delivered. They all had their little wagons, horseman wagons, or they had, you know, the sleighs in the wintertime and so forth. And I know at the time we were living in Deering, my mother, because we had the telephone by then, and my mother would call up on Wednesday, and she always called a man named Wilson down on Oxford Street in Portland, who had a very fine collection of meats, and would give her order on a Wednesday, and he'd come out with his wagon. Probably had a number of customers in our neighborhood. Come out and deliver the groceries, always in a basket, you know, a regular straw basket. And so that, as I say, I would pester the people in the neighborhood to buy these things from the Great Atlantic and Tea Company, whatever it was, and go and buy raw savings things. Well, another thing that happened was that the boys, what boys there were in my neighborhood, they were imbued with patriotism like I was, and my aunt, who had a rather spacious backyard, would let us dig trenches in it, and we'd play with toy guns and that sort of thing in trench warfare, because of course that was what was going on in France at that time, France and Belgium, and all the time these people were getting killed by the hundreds of thousands, and we were over there playing with the same kind of thing. And it was a great many years before we began to wake up and realize that, you know, what a terrible thing war was, and that we were really being taken in by propaganda. And I think to a large extent it sort of radicalized me, because later on in life I became very peace-minded, and also very skeptical about what the leaders of my country and my nation and my world told me about these things. I think it developed when I was a very young kid, that I became very skeptical about all this stuff. And now, so far as the school was concerned, I don't think I was particularly happy at this Catholic grammar school that I went to. In the first place, a lot of the boys there were from very poor families, and on the whole, they were pretty rough kids, and a lot of them just testing out their strength and their courage and that sort of thing, so that I got involved in a great many scrapes, and sometimes would almost be picked on by some other kids, because my aunt was very fussy about my clothes and about always having clean shirts and clothes and so forth. And some of these poor kids would come from a neighborhood where they didn't even have a bathroom, and so that I think one or two of friends of mine and I were, to some extent, engaged in fisticuffs from time to time, and we weren't all that pugnacious or even very strong, but for the most part, I think both of us, particularly one boy, George Blackburn, and I wouldn't let ourselves be humbled. In other words, we put up a fight of some kind and try to make the best of it. And then another boy came to school who was an enormous kid named Charlie Murphy, who was probably about almost 6 feet tall, very rugged, red hair, and could handle almost anybody in a fight. And Charlie sort of took our side, so from that time on we never had all that much trouble. One of the good things about going to that school, it was right down in the middle of town, and there was a flower shop across the street on the corner, a little restaurant thing now, and I used to deliver flowers all around the city for 10 cents a trip. And sometimes it was out in Woodford, and I had to go 2 or 3 miles out to Woodford. The people would give me my car fare. They'd give me, say, an extra 20 cents to deliver these things. And rather than spend that 20 cents, I'd walk all the way out there and back to save the 20 cents. Then there were other opportunities. I know once there was a S.K. Ames, was a sort of chain store at that time that sold butter and eggs and some other things. And they had a shop on Congress Street. And I can remember one time I had a job there, sitting down in this rather dank cellar, bagging coffee. And then some other job would come up, and I'd leave and do that. And the best job I ever had was in the Jefferson Theater, which was right next to the school I went to. And that was a rather grand theater. It had been built probably about 1890 or so. And it had been famous for its plays, and they had great actors and actresses come from all over the world there. And it had sort of fallen on rough times by 1918. And sometimes they'd have a movie come there, and I can remember one movie in particular, Robin Hood with Douglas Fairbanks, who would come and stay for a month or a month and a half, something like that. And so we would be the ushers to give people the seats, and they would have 2 matinees a week, and probably each evening. And that was a wonderful job, because first of all, we began to see this marvelous picture, and it seemed to me the most romantic picture I ever saw. But of course we soon got sick of it. We saw it too many times. And then they used to have these companies come, No Nanette, a musical comedy came and stayed a month. And then there was an old-time Shakespearean actor named Robert D. Mantell, who had been a Shakespearean specialist for 50 years. And he was then probably in his 70s. But he had a beautiful young wife, Genevieve Hamper, who was about 27, 28 years old, a lovely woman, gorgeous hair, and just as young and spirited as she could be. And it always seemed rather strange to us. We were, 10 years old, to see this grizzly old man and this wonderful young wife. And so at times, when they were doing a Shakespeare play, for example, they would need extras, or what they called, what do they call them? Well, there's a special name they call it. So they would take us off ushering duties and take us up on stage and outfit us in various costumes. For example, if there was a dinner scene at a big table in one of the historical plays, we'd be sitting there quaffing, ostensibly quaffing a glass of wine or something of that sort. If there was a battle scene, we'd be dressed as soldiers, and they'd put us out in the back of the scenery, and we'd jostle spears and things against each other to make the noise of a battle, and all sorts of things that we did of that kind. So we were actually had a part in the play, and so this went on, and this all took place within this 1 year. But I think inasmuch as I later went back and went to that school for another year, I think actually I did work at the theater for some time after that, maybe when I was 12 or 13 years old or something like that. So anyway, as long as my mother was in the hospital, we stayed in Portland. I then went back to Deering to finish up at the Cummings School. Well, now, life in the country, because it virtually was on the edge of the country, was rather wonderful in many ways. My father had a boyhood friend who owned a farm, a man named Eddie Knowles, and he had been a druggist originally in town, But when his, I think his grandfather, his father died and left him this big farm where he had cattle and raised vegetables, and I think he had small animals, probably some sheep, things like that. And so we got involved, I and my sisters to some extent, and my boyhood friends all got involved in working at this farm. And we would go haying, we'd tend the horses. In the winter time, I'd go out on the milk route of Eddie Knowles. He had one of the very first little Ford pickup trucks that he used to let me drive when I was probably 12, 13 years old. So that was the first experience I had with driving. And I'd go get up at 5:30 in the morning just to have a chance to drive the car. And in the summertime, as we got a little older, the natural thing for boys out in that area to do was to go caddying at the country club, the Portland Country Club. And we'd meet down at what we call the Point. That's the section where you come over the Tookies Bridge and you make a right turn there to go out to Falmouth. And very often we could just stand there, and these men, mostly professional men, lawyers and doctors and so forth, who were going out to the country club to play golf, would pick us up. And it was only about less than 3 miles off there, so we very seldom had to walk. And that was a very good way for us to make a little money. And actually, at a time when the average family man wasn't making much more than $20 or $25 a week, we could go out there in an afternoon and make $1.50 or $2, which is a lot of money then for a kid. Although we threw it away, and then we'd spend it on foolish things, candy and ice cream, stuff like that. And so this was all preparatory to our going to high school. And so when I decided to go to high school in town, I went to the Catholic high school, and I only stayed about a year because I didn't like it. I didn't get along well. And so then I transferred over to Portland High School, where I spent the next 4 years or so. So that's it up to that point about. Now, about this same time that we're talking about, I'm sort of leaving out a lot of things that I did. Because I think I had developed a lot of curiosity as a kid, and I was interested in everything, well, in a sense, everything. Everything that I was capable of learning. And I think learning meant a lot to me. I didn't learn in the sense that I was trying to take advantage of learning, because I wasn't particularly a good student. I mean, I didn't pay attention to things. My mind wandered. I dreamed a lot. I dreamt an awful lot. And I'll come to that in a minute, because that sustained me through a lot of my youth. But so far as my activities are concerned, aside from this such kind of dull recital of my days, I was fascinated by nature. I was fascinated by the woods and the trees. Some of the kids that I played with, we were right on the edge of a fairly large forest. We spent a lot of time in the trees. We built tree houses. And I remember building one very wonderful one, right in back of where Bill Jordan lives today, because he lives in that same neighborhood. Fascinated by boats, and we were very close to the Presumpscot River and the inner bay, and from a very early period on, we hung around the waterfront, and it was a more or less isolated kind of waterfront, where there were old scows brought up on the sand and that sort of thing. We had one old scow that we sort of made into a clubhouse. At the very same time that I was engaged in my waterfront activities, I was reading some marvelous books. It was a period when probably for about after 1860 on, there were some marvelous children's writers, both women and men. And I will say that this school that I went to, and this old library that I mentioned, had a very good collection of these books. And a great many of them dealt with historical periods. For instance, Revolution, the Civil War, French and Indian Wars. I was fascinated by the warfare between the Indians and the colonists. And I must say that in a sense I was very much more sympathetic to the Indians than I was to the colonists, because I could see very easily that the Indians were being dispossessed of their land, and that the colonists were really the ones who were as cruel, if not crueler, than the Indians were, because when they sent parties out to kill the Indians, very often they insisted on their scalping the Indians so they could bring back the proof that they had killed them. And the scalp was the proof that they could then cash in on it, that they'd get £5 or whatever they gave them in Boston for bringing these scalps back. So that my whole sympathies in those years was with the Indians. And I think it later led, when I'm going ahead now another 10 years or so, it led to my sympathy for black people when I saw the way that I read about them, and also saw the way that they were mistreated. And I started very early, when I began to collect books and so forth, putting together a collection of things that had to do with the blacks, with abolitionism, and the brave people who, against very grave odds in the 1820s and 30s, began to fight for the abolition of slavery. And so that eventually I put together a collection of about 3,000 books, which is now known by my name at the University of Maine at Orono. I've always been radicalized in the sense that I'm skeptical about the way the world and the country is governed. And I have relatively small faith in the way things go on. But at the same time, in later years, I had to be practical because I had a family and had to support them. So although I took some awful chances at times, and people considered me a red and all the rest of it, somehow or other I never gave up those ideas. Still have them to this day. But at any rate, to go back to those years, one of the great things that I found when I lived with my aunt on State Street, my aunt, by the way, had 2 children. She had a girl who was a nurse, a very progressive nurse who later became rather well-known in her field, and a son who was a doctor, a medical doctor. As I say, they lived in a very large house, and they had loads of books. And I think that's where my first interest in Irish literature took place, because my uncle, or my cousin rather, who owned a lot of these books when he was younger, was also interested in the Irish background of his family, and so that he had a great many books that dealt with the folklore and the legends of Ireland, and at the same time a great many historical novels, including the complete works of Sir Walter Scott, which I began to read when I was about 10 years old. And I loved the historical aspect of Scott novels. Curiosity was something that was, I think, always in my mind, and I never thought very much in terms of making a formal education for myself, because I had always had a feeling that I could do it pretty much on my own. And yet at the same time, in later years, I realized that I probably would have been better off if I'd had more formal education. And I had the feeling it was so easy to learn by yourself that why bother with all that? And to some extent, I think I had, you know, some reasonable kind of success doing it my own way, but then again, I've always sort of envied the people who went and had a sort of a formal education. Wondered if I hadn't missed something. But this business of curiosity. My grandfather O'Brien, this man who had the shoe business, began to spend his summers at Peaks Island from about 1885 on, so that all these boys of his who were children about that time, growing up from that period, had always had either a house or a cottage down there. And probably the most interesting period for Peaks Island began around that period, because that was when the Greenwood Garden, which is sort of a big minor old orchard, was organized. And this is a piece of land about, well, probably at least 20 acres in extent, with a big fence around it. And there was a merry-go-round, and there were all kinds of activities. And then a large building, which was known as Greenwood Garden, which was given over to plays. And they had actors come there, and they had summer theaters and so forth. And then on top of that, they built down right near the landing, they built this enormous building, which is like a sort of super Nissen hut, except that it was 50 times larger than a Nissen hut, but with a round, sort of a rounded top on it. And that became one of the first summer theaters in the country. And they had famous actors come here and give plays, and they did marvelous things. And that continued to be very successful until the automobile came in. And I might say that in addition to the gem theater, this is called the Gem Theater, in addition to that, when the trolley cars flourished from about 1890 on, I think the first trolley cars in Portland were electric cars were from about 1890 and 91. Before that, we had horse cars. And we did have horse cars that went all over the city of Portland. But at any rate, in order to have places for people to go to on the trolley cars, they set up entertainment parks at the end of the line. For instance, Riverton Park was an enormous success for many, many years, where they had plays and they had canoes that could be rented. And very often I would see, as a kid, I would see a fellow and a girl renting a canoe and going off, I suppose, to hide in some branch of the river someplace. And out at Cape Elizabeth, we had another summer theater, which was very famous, known as Bobby McCallum's Theater. And they put on plays themselves, but they also had some of the best known actors in the country come put these on. Well, the same thing happened down at Peaks Island, except that that was run by the steamboat company, as against the trolley car companies that ran these others. And so that when they began to go downhill was around the time the automobile came in large numbers. That happened to the trolleys, and it also happened, it also affected the things on Peaks Island. And at a later period, in the 20s, my uncle, Leo, my father's brother, took over both the Greenwood Garden and the Gem Theater. And so the summers that I spent down there, I worked for him. And we had a very large drugstore, for example, in the Gem Theater, and I was supposed to run that in the morning, open it up in the morning. And also have to, they had a combination movie theater and dance floor in the Gem, because they'd given up plays and things. And one of my jobs was to clean that enormous sweep that enormous dance floor. And well, one of the things that interested me in the drugstore was that we had daily papers and magazines, and Portland News Company would bring down this great assortment of newspapers and magazines of all kinds. And I know the very first time I ever heard the word James Joyce, you know, probably the greatest novelist of our period, of our century, was when I saw this magazine that purported to publish the first episode of Ulysses. And I read it, and I couldn't make much sense of it, but a week or two later, I read in one of the newspapers that had been seized for being pornography. And it was the first time I'd ever even known of such a thing, or known of anybody being arrested for it in this country. And that, of course, made me extremely curious about that whole business. And I think it was the beginning of my interest in collecting Irish literature. And so, at any rate, during this period that I worked on the island, I had various other jobs. I worked for a cousin of mine on a Cushman route, delivering bread all over the island. And now I was, 11 or 12 years old at that time. And my cousin, who was not unmarried, but a great womanizer, was always saying to me, "Now, Francis, you take the truck and drive over, and I'll meet you in about 3/4 of an hour over so-and-so." And I knew perfectly well that he was calling on this woman over there almost every day. And so that we ran into a little argument a week or two after that, and I quit because he wouldn't give me any more money. He was paying me $5 a week, and I wanted 6 or whatever. So one night he was taking his truck back to Portland, and he ran into my grandfather, who was coming down on the boat. And he lived with my aunt down there in the morning, and then he would come back on the boat at night. So my grandfather said to Charlie, who was his nephew, "Charlie, what's this business between you and Francis?" He said, "I can't understand why you're not getting along." And Charlie, who was an awful liar, said to my grandfather, "Francis, you can't imagine the trouble I'm having with that boy. He's chasing women all over." He was an 11-year-old boy, chasing women all over the route. And he said, "I just put up with it." My grandfather believed it. And my grandfather had another son who was notorious as a womanizer, very handsome man who had been in the hotel business, and probably, as my father said, he's probably been married about 5 times, but I don't think he's ever actually went through a ceremony. You know, so my grandfather said to my aunt, Mary, she said, "I don't know what we're going to do with Francis." He said, "He may turn out the way that Jim did." So you see the notorious reputation I got at 11 or 12 years old. But anyway, the island was a sort of an important part of my life. And but eventually, of course, we went back to Portland High School and settled up. I didn't get along all that well at Portland High School. I'm afraid I was a bit of a cut-up. I went with a bunch of guys that we were interested as much as anything else in humbling some of the more pretentious boys, especially the West Enders, as we call them. I mean, boys from the Promenade and the Eastern Promenade, Western Promenade, and so on. And these were all kids who were quite well off and thought well of themselves. And they all had fraternities of their own. And some of these fraternities had been established for, well, 2 or 3 generations. So this gang of ours got together, and we started a fraternity of our own called we had to start off with the nearest to a prestigious name. So I think I picked Pi Beta Kappa. And so there were about, I think, a dozen of us or so in the fraternity. And we weren't bad kids. I mean, there was really no evil or anything of that kind. But we were up to raising hell all the time. And if we could bring any of these snobs down, we delighted in it. And it was just jealousy on our part, of course, that we couldn't be, well regarded. So that we did raise a little hell in the sense that I finally got kicked out of Portland High School as a result. because one day they had a May Day celebration, and the girls had gone to great trouble to make dresses for themselves, and they had a maypole up on the stage. And when they, some of these boys, these friends of mine and I were out in the wings, and as the girls were dancing to music around the maypole and ostensibly throwing flowers out of their baskets, one of them dared me to go out and join them, which I did, and grabbed the basket and started throwing flowers out. And of course it brought the school down. And Artie Lowe, who was our principal at that time, wonderful man, very Lincoln-esque, 6'3" or 4 or something like that. He rushed up onto the platform, grabbed me by the collar, pulled me out, dragged me out, and of course kicked me out of school. And I became kind of notorious for that. But I did get back eventually, and it kept me out a few months. But, well, that's about the time I met my wife, and she was in one of my classes, and I fell in love with her at 16 or whatever. And she wouldn't look at me. And, I used to tease her, and get her off one side and lie like hell over. And eventually, I guess I broke down her resistance or something. But it was another few years before we got married. So that's basically what happened in high school. I didn't get very good marks, but high school did a lot for me in the sense that I made good use of the library. And I did kind of leave out along the way here that two of the great discoveries that I made when I was in those younger years, and the first one was the public library. From the time I was very young, and meeting a very wonderful and caring lady who was our children's librarian, Miss Haggard from Bangor, from Brunswick, woman I never forgot, and I'm very friendly with her down to the day she died. And she did a lot for me, very sympathetic. And then the other thing was my first going to Houston's bookstore on Exchange Street, which is this very old bookstore going back to about 1829. And I spent as much time there as I could. And I hated to go there without buying something. And with my weekly allowance, which wasn't very much, 10 or 15 cents, I would go there every Saturday, for example, and buy one or two books, because Houston would have wonderful books for 5 or 10 cents. So that hanging around with him and meeting a lot of the older men who were book readers and book collectors, who got to know me after a while, because Houston would say, this fellow's in here all the time buying books and so on. So they got to know me, and I talked to a lot of them. Thomas Bird Moser was one of them. And men that I knew later in life that were very cultured individuals. And so, as I say, a lot of my, well, I won't go into my dream life, because that's sort of funny, but I dreamt a lot in school. Mostly of, and this is not a particularly peculiar thing, it's the desert island complex that I think a lot of boys, and maybe girls too, mostly probably boys, go through. And there were some wonderful books in that period about living on desert islands, being, just not just Robinson Crusoe, but other things where a man would be cast up onto a desert island. He'd have to make his own way. He'd have to invent things. He'd have to, and in the case of some of these well-known stories, these were men who fortunately had been wonderful carpenters and mechanics and that sort of thing before in their previous life, so that when they were cast up on this island, they would actually find the means to invent all sorts of things with what they had to do it. And so this, I think, had a great influence. on me. And I think girls took some part in this too, because this is a time when I suppose like most kids of that age, you were getting, you were thinking about girls. So very often there'd be a girl in my dreams of the castaway business, and which was always a lot of fun. And you'd spend day after day thinking about these things, without being able to do a damn thing about it. So that's probably 16 when I probably first took a trip to sea, and on one of these summer trips on a coastwise vessel. And I had another chum that went with me. They made the first trip to sea. So that's about as far as I think I can go now. But, well, I think at Bowman High School, we had one teacher that we were all very fond of. His name was Lucius Libby, and he was the submaster of Bowman High School. And he was a man who had gone to Bowdoin around the turn of the century, and had a sort of rollicking good nature, upon which you could not tread too intimately, but nevertheless, a lot of the boys, mostly the boys in the class, would try to kid him a lot. And although he was a married man without children, and probably, as far as I know, a wonderful relationship with his wife, but I got to know them after. There was a lot of kidding about what he did at Bowdoin, and one time one of the boys made free enough to say, or ask him if he knew of that particular Lover's Lane in Bowdoin. And Luke, we used to call him Luke said, well, yes, he said, I've heard of that, I've heard of it. And so this boy made bold enough to say, well, Mr. Libby, I understand that you frequented that quite often. And so there was a lot of banter back and forth about this. But at any rate, this is where I first met Connie, and Connie sat in front of me, in the desk in front of me, and I was taken with her right away. She was a cute little thing, and she had wonderful red hair, sort of a chestnut hair. In those days, she used to cut very short, very boyish. But at any rate, I used to tease her a lot, and I thought she hated me. In fact, she very often acted as though she did. But sometimes I'd engage her after class, and I would stand around by one of the windows, and I'd tell her all kinds of lies. And so the thing sort of began to work after a while. And I had never had a steady girl. I hung out with a girl, just in passing. And so this became really the first serious engagement I ever had with a girl. And so I think that following summer, this was the summer before we graduated, I was invited down to a parents' house down in Long Island. And I was so nervous about the whole thing that I overdid it. I packed a big suitcase full of all kinds of changes of clothes. I was only going to be there 3 days. And her father said to her afterwards, he said, what the hell, what are you thinking about this being the first girl? I was, you know how boys will cling together and form a group. Well, when I lived out in Deering, I belonged to the Boy Scouts at the Washington Avenue Methodist Church. And that took up a good part of my life during those years, probably 12 to 13, 14 along in there. But I was thrown against 3 other boys that we became a sort of group. And one of them was a fellow named Howard Lunt, who later became a golf pro. In fact, all these 3 boys became golf pros. And it was, at that time, we were all caddying out at the Boston Country Club. I mentioned that before. But
do you remember the other 2 names? Howard Lunt.
Howard Lunt was one. Clay Tucker was another.
Clay? Clayton.
Clayton Tucker, and a fellow named Clayton Sweeney, the two Claytons. And all three eventually became golf pros. Clayton was the only one, Clayton Sweeney was the only one who lasted here in Portland, and he became the golf pro at the Portland Municipal Golf Club, where we were. And not only were we interested in golf, although I was no good at it, because I was never really good at any athletic thing, but they were all very good at it. And so I kind of tagged along and they put up with it. But we also formed a comedy skit, which was more or less imitative of some of the vaudeville acts that used to come to Keith's Theater in those days. And we were very much taken up with these little skits and dancing and telling jokes and, you know, one thing and another. And we were very often asked around to various churches to put on, in connection with church fairs and that sort of thing. And there was a man older than us who lived in the neighborhood, a fellow named Bob Goff. Now, Bob Goff had gone to Bowdoin College for a couple of years, and then he had, no, I guess he graduated from Bowdoin College, and then had taught at a college in Pennsylvania, Lafayette College. And then had come home and did nothing actually outside of, he lived with his mother. And his father was a railroad engineer, and they were comfortable people. And apparently they never asked anything of Bob except that he'd be around and sort of, you know, take care of the house and so forth. Well, as it turned out, Bob was gay, and we were not very conscious of those things at that time until people began to tell us that, not that our association with Bob was suspect at all, because none of us had any inclination that way. But we got to know the guy and like him, and I think that to some extent we were influenced by him. I know I was to a great extent, because Bob was he had taught French. He was very much an intellectual. And if you can imagine this guy kind of isolated in his own way, just as you'll in a small country towns and find one or two guys that are gay that sort of make a little society of their own. I've seen this time and time again all over the state of Maine. In fact, up in my town in Hiram, there's a little group of school teachers and musicians and so forth that kind of cling together like that, and sort of typical of this kind of gay situation. And so that Bob was our pianist. And when we got together to form these little skits and things, like Bob would always be there to play the piano for us. He was a great piano player. In fact, later in life, he became a professional, led a sort of a dance band. He played the piano and had other members of the band. So Bob had a lot of influence on me from the point of view of knowing all the trends and the things that were happening in the world of books. And although I had picked up a fair amount of knowledge from my own reading and my book buying and that sort of thing, he was much more sophisticated about this whole thing. And I think I began to realize that there were two ways, maybe more than two ways, of looking at this whole thing, that it's a literature. So that I think the fact that I knew him during this period, and we were never intimate or anything of that kind, but he was always ready with conversation and with answers, and in many ways, I think he made much more of an influence on me than he did on the other boys, because the other boys were never interested in anything intellectual. But one of the things that came out of this association with these three boys is that Tucker, one of the boys, had two wonderful twin sisters, and they were known everywhere as the Tucker twins, because at a very early age they had studied dancing, and the school in those days that everybody went to in Portland was the Emerson Mason Dance School. And in fact, they've been more or less alive up until just a few years. But the Tucker twins became very much in demand. They were wonderful, beautiful little girls that had fine little faces, and they had gorgeous black hair down to their waist. And I suppose I fell in love with the Tucker twins.
Both of them?
Well, there was always a question because there was another boy, a boy named Ralph Murray, who was, we were supposed to be, both of us supposed to be in love with the Tucker twins. They wouldn't look at us, frankly. And I suppose we devised all kinds of schemes to go down and visit their brother, get in the house, just to be able to look at them. And virtually that's all that ever happened. But in our minds of minds, I suppose we probably dreamed about these little girls. And so that really was, I think those are the first girls that I ever really fell in love with. Mm-hmm. And basically it was because I think of their looks and their beauty. And they eventually both married very well in later life. I think one of them is dead. The other one I think is still living up, probably up in the Portland house. And I've never seen her since. I mean, it's been, what, 75 years or so. But anyway, that was the first time I ever really fell in love with her. Sort of a transition between Emma Tucker and Connie McDonald. And so anyway, this brings us down to the end of high school, which was we were actually half a year behind the rest of our class. So we graduated with another class. We graduated in the class of 1926, but we should have been in the class of 1925. And it seems to be the first summer that I graduated, I went to, well, this brings me to another chum of mine, a boy named Ralph Murray, who was a neighbor, who lived in my neighborhood. And the interesting thing about Murray was that he and I were both Catholics, living in a neighborhood that was almost all Protestant. Hmm. And of people whose fathers, in many cases, were not only Protestant, but were also members of the Ku Klux Klan. Mm. Because the Ku Klux Klan flourished during those years in Portland, all a matter of four or 5 years perhaps. And a lot of people were taken in by it. And they had a hall that they had an old building out on Forest Avenue that they'd taken over. And they built a huge barn-like dance hall where they gave weekly dances. And I don't know whether you have any knowledge at all of what went on in those days, but there was an awful lot of bigotry in the country. And a lot of the people, kind of parents that I knew that lived in my neighborhood were people who either come in from the country with all their prejudices, or had come from Canada, a great many of them had come from Canada, and were connected with the Grand Trunk Railroad. Mm-hmm. Because the old roundhouse of the Grand Trunk Railroad was out there in East Darien, but it still is. And so that there was another problem in that the pastor of my church, St. Joseph's Church, out on what is now Stevens Avenue, opposite Westwood College, was very much against my belonging to this Boy Scout troop and a Protestant church. But my parents were quite liberal about this thing, and they saw no harm in it at all, and really didn't mean a thing to me. And I was beginning to be very skeptical about religion anyway to begin with, so it had no influence on me. And the main thing was I got along with these boys, and I think we all became very friendly. Might have had a few enemies, but for the most part we were all quite friendly. Did the same, pretty much the same thing. And so that I think the first summer out of school, Ralph Murray and I decided to take a trip to sea. And we used to go down and hang around the waterfront as these ships would come in. And eventually we got signed on a ship that was going coastwise, that is going down the coast to, I think, Norfolk, Virginia, as wipers. Now the wiper in the engine room of the ship is the lowest possible job you could have. In other words, you're a grease monkey. You're down there cleaning up after the engineers and the oilers and this sort of thing. And I can't remember too much about the details of the ship, but, you know, of the trip. But nevertheless, it sort of interested us in further adventures along the same line. So that over the next 2 or 3 years, I guess we, either he and I, or I alone, sometimes he alone, would make these trips. And Ralph himself, in later life, actually became a chief engineer. He made a career out of it. And he's dead now. He died about 10 or 12 years ago. But we were very close friends.
Mm-hmm.
So I think just before that the last time we taped this thing, that I had discovered Houston, the bookstore, at 92 Exchange Street. And it was a shop that he had bought in 1910 when he came from Rockland, where he had formerly had a bookshop there. And he had come to Portland with the idea of selling books by mail order not from an office building. And he found that by the time he got here, a much older business called Colesworthy Bookstore, which was founded in 1819, and had gone through 2 or 3 generations of the Colesworthys, was at last inherited by the last of the Colesworthys, who were so well-to-do that he really didn't have to work, so he wanted to sell the business. And the Colesworthys over the years had prospered, and they owned a great deal of real estate in town and so forth. And so he had no need to work and really was not much interested in business. So Houston bought it and transferred it from the name of Colesworthy to Houston, H.A. Houston. And inherited this very large quantity of books, probably 7,500 books. And so in 1918, at the age of 10, I discovered this, and I used to go there every week when I had my 10 or 15 cents and buy a book or 2 or 3 or whatever. And that's when I mentioned having met some of the older men of the town who were also interested in books. Thomas Bird Moser, and a number of mostly lawyers around the street there. So that the knowledge, whatever knowledge that I picked up along the way through my reading, did not exactly head me toward dreaming about going to the book business, but the combination of this and the atmosphere of the bookshop, plus the additional information that I was getting on up-to-date literature through Von Gough, had a great deal to do with shaping my, later life, my later career. And but I think the thing that I almost immediately that I wanted to do was to get away from Portland. Portland struck me as well from some of the grandiose ideas that I acquired from reading. Romantic ideas, wonderment about the big world, about getting out there in the big world, and so forth. Naturally led me to think in terms of even getting out of the country and going to Europe. And I dreamed a lot about getting out of Portland and going to Europe. And of course I made 2 or 3 trips to sea, and I'd seen terminals in the world. And so I think it was the 1920, oh, wait a minute. No, I think the first thing I thought of doing was going to New York. Yeah, I think that was it. 1927 or 28. One of the computers.
Well, 19,
Fall of 1926, I think I went to New York.
okay. You graduated in 1926 also, right?
Yeah. I graduated in the spring, in February, actually. So this is, so whatever I did during the summer, I can't remember, but I was in New York in the fall.
In the fall.
And I looked up a...
How did you get half a year behind? Were you out because
I
of...
had transferred from my Catholic school.
Oh, I see. Okay.
They held me back a year.
You
They
did.
held me back a half.
Uh-huh.
And so when I went to New York, either my mother or someone told me to look up a cousin of mine, sort of a distant cousin. I think she was the fourth or fifth, or probably third or fourth removed, something like that, originally before me. And she worked for it was a Fifth Avenue department store. It wasn't exactly a department store. It was made up of a lot of specialized shops.
You mean like Bergdorf Goodman or Bond?
And the name is just vanished at the moment, but it'll come back quickly.
Okay.
And I looked her up in her place of business. And this is a gigantic building right on Fifth Avenue, not too far from the public library. And I never met her in my life. I mean, she never came back to Portland, so I know her. Of course, she knew exactly what it was. And I asked her, was there any possibility of getting a job? She said, well, I think I can get you a job. And she took me and introduced me to some people in the building. And she was kind of know exactly what she did, but she has some sort of a half-important job. And she had the kind of personality that was lively, and everybody knew her, and everybody knew her by name. And they had an employees organization, and she was the head of it. I mean, they would put on their parties and put on entertainments and things of that sort. She was there, I would say, probably, well, I was probably 16. I would say she was probably in her late 40s. And she was married to a man who was in the real estate business. At least that's what he was supposed to be. And I guess at one time he had been fairly successful, but I don't think he could have gotten by without her, because I think whatever her salary was helped to support both of them. And they lived way up on the west side, 181st Street. And it was a long ways up on what they call Washington Heights. And they lived in an apartment house that, well, that was very 8 or 10 stories high. I know there was a very famous Jewish humorist who was very well known in those days, lived in the same house. And I met Joseph Campbell. Everybody knew him. And he had a newspaper column. And so anyway, she insisted that I come home and stay with them. She had an extra room. The husband was rather hostile in his idea. He was not unfriendly, but at the same time, apparently he had his own way of doing things, and I think he spent a lot of time ostensibly doing business outside, but probably spending quite a lot of time in bars. Because she used to tell me that he drank a lot. Yet I never saw him drunk, I never saw him abusive or anything of that kind, but they sort of lived apart. They weren't very friendly to each other. And so anyway, she was very kind to me, and began to teach me little things that I probably should have known anyway. And I'd never forget. Now, have a habit of washing my own socks, for example. And she was the first one that every night she'd say, now you want to go in and wash your socks. Well, I suppose my mother took for granted that I washed my socks, and we lived, you know, in a half decent way and so forth. But I became kind of a fanatic at washing my socks every night. I remember that she took me into the bathroom and showed me how to do it, as if I couldn't figure it out myself, but it became a habit that lasted down to this time. And I lived with her about 2 months, and she was a woman that I suppose would be called quite good looking. But for some reason or other, I never thought of anything like, you know, any affection or anything of that sort. But it finally came to a point where what I would, to use a phrase that's common today, but she began to come on to me. And I scared the hell out of her. And you know, one night this is pleasant, I don't think you mind it, but one night she called to me and she found it taking a bath and gone to bed early, and she was propped up in bed, and I was in my own breathing, and she called me by name, so I came in. And she said, don't I smell nice? And you know, she was taking a bath. Well, I said, yeah, wonderful. And she said, just lean over and don't smell something. Well, that scared the hell out of me. And I should have been grateful, actually, you know, as it turned out in the long run, but I couldn't wait to get the hell out of that house. I suppose it was a little too much too soon. And in the meantime, I had met 3 or 4 boys from Portland who were asking me to come and live with them. And which I did. And of course it caused, she was very, very sore at what I did. And eventually I had to give the job up because she was ignoring me. And I realized that it was a very uncomfortable situation. So that I went looking for another job, and I found another job. I found a job with a movie outfit called the Dry Camera Corporation, and running errands and that sort of thing. And I lived there, and I lived with the boys actually until the next spring when I came back to Portland for a while. And of course, in the meantime, I think she had said something to some of my brothers at home about, well, he was very hard to get along with, and so to explain this breakup. And so I forget what happened. Oh, the next, when I came home in the spring, I could think only in terms of no, I'm wrong. I left New York, I took a boat to South Carolina, passed the boat. I ended up in Florida. And Jacksonville, Florida. And I got a job in a newspaper, the Florida Times Union, which is the leading paper, as a copy boy. And I stayed there for several months, and then I got an idea that I wanted to go to New Orleans. And I started a hitchhike across to New Orleans, and I ran into 2 or 3 other boys on the way who seemed very decent when I first met them, but it turned out that they were they were very good families, but they were on the loose, and turned out that they were very crooked-minded, because they questioned me a lot about my family and about my home and all the rest lived, I probably told it to money. Because by the time I got rid of them, I separated from them and kept on going to New Orleans, mostly either hitchhiking or riding on freight trains. They, in the meantime, had gotten in touch with my folks and said as if I had sent them a telegram and saying that I was in trouble in the South, needed some money. Please send $200 immediately, which my folks did, because I didn't know all this until much later. And that sort of an introduction to the, some of the less pleasant things in life. But anyway, I did get to New Orleans, and from there I got a ship to go to Brazil. And I made the trip to Brazil and Argentina and so forth. And when I get back to New Orleans, I got another ship to go to the West Coast, to the canal. And I spent the winter, that next winter was spent on the West Coast. And it was a very dreary, very bad one, because instead of staying aboard the ship, I get off the ship thinking I could get a job in Los Angeles. And so, for some time before I got another ship, and I went up to Puget Sound, Tacoma, Washington, Bellingham, Washington. And so a lot of things happened during that period, but mostly very depressing. Because I got sick and had to go to the hospital in Bellingham. But anyway, finally got back to the East Coast, back upon it. And I got into all of the tales, flashes from my mind. Let me stop right there. I've got it.